Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you? The full mythology Lovecraft created was never meant to comfort anyone or bring peace. Instead, it works as an anti-mythology, a careful breaking down of every belief that puts human awareness at the center, purpose at the end, or meaning anywhere in the design. It is not just a group of monster stories, but a deep philosophical system showing that humanity holds only a small and accidental place in the universe. This is not a mythology with heroes or happy endings. In Lovecraft's universe, the outer gods do not fight humanity, because fighting would mean they notice us. The great old ones do not threaten our future, because they existed long before our past, across stretches of time we cannot truly understand. The forbidden books do not harm people because they are evil. They harm because they are true, revealing parts of reality our minds were never built to handle. Over the next 3 hours, we will follow the entire structure, from Azathoth's blind dreaming at the center of existence, through the great old ones as ancient remains of civilizations that lived and disappeared before the earth had even fully formed, to the human cults who wrongly believe they can make deals with cosmic forces that do not care about them. Think about this. Most mythologies explain why humans are important. Lovecraft's explains why we are not. Most worldviews place humanity as watchers or active players. His places us as brief background noise in a signal we are not made to understand. Tonight, we will gather not only the beings and the events, but also the deeper ideas. Cosmic indifference as a basic rule of reality. Forbidden knowledge as something that harms the mind, and sanity as the careful protection of comforting illusions about our importance. And maybe we will see the full design. This is not horror based on what might happen. It is horror based on what has always been true, quietly existing beneath our belief that reality cares whether we understand it. Let us begin the complete exploration. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island, into a family already in decline. His father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was committed to Butler Hospital in 1893, almost certainly suffering from psychosis linked to untreated syphilis, and died there in 1898. Lovecraft was 8 years old. His mother, Sarah Susan Phillips, raised him in the shadow of that institutional absence, growing increasingly unstable herself until her own commitment to Butler Hospital in 1919. The household that shaped Lovecraft was not merely troubled. It was haunted by the particular New England combination of former respectability and present erosion. Old family portraits on the walls of rooms that could no longer be properly heated. His grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, filled the void with books. The elder Phillips maintained a substantial library and encouraged young Howard's appetite for Poe, the Arabian Nights, Greek mythology, and astronomy. He told the boy Gothic tales of his own invention, stories of dark woods and nameless things. When Whipple died in 1904 and the family's finances collapsed, forcing the sale of their home at 454 Angel Street, Lovecraft described it as a grief so severe he considered suicide at 14. This is not biographical trivia. The pattern of loss, of fathers, of homes, of social standing, of certainty, became the emotional architecture of everything he would write. The recurring motif of the ancestral estate harboring terrible secrets, which appears in stories from The Rats in the Walls to The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, traces directly to this childhood of vanished grandeur. There was also the matter of the nightmares. From early childhood, Lovecraft was tormented by what he called night gaunts, faceless, rubbery, black, winged entities that seized him in his sleep and carried him through the sky over alien landscapes before dropping him into the void. These were not literary inventions retrofitted into biography. They preceded his fiction by decades. He described them in letters with the clinical precision of someone documenting a recurring medical condition. The night gaunts would eventually appear in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927. But by then, they had already spent 20 years as uninvited visitors to his sleeping mind. The mythology did not begin at a writing desk. It began in the involuntary theater of a child's nightmares. What distinguished Lovecraft from other weird fiction writers was his philosophical framework. He called himself a mechanistic materialist, meaning he believed the universe operated entirely through physical law, without purpose, consciousness, or design. He arrived at this position not through academic philosophy, but through his childhood obsession with astronomy. By age 8, he was fascinated by the planets. By 12, he was writing columns on astronomy for local newspapers and had acquired a telescope. He had internalized before adolescence the scale of the cosmos, the distances between stars measured in light years, the indifference of celestial mechanics to human affairs, and the insignificance it implied. When he later wrote of vast entities sleeping between the stars, he was drawing on an emotional relationship with astronomical reality that predated his fiction by years. Yet here was the contradiction that powered the mythology. Lovecraft, the philosopher, believed in a cold, indifferent universe. Lovecraft, the person, was deeply nostalgic, emotionally attached to colonial New England architecture, to the 18th century, to the idea of a rooted and ordered civilization. He wore outdated clothing. He wrote in a deliberately archaic prose style. He walked the streets of Providence at night, cataloging colonial-era buildings with a passion that bordered on devotion. His fiction lives in the gap between these positions. The mythology is what happens when someone who desperately wants the universe to be meaningful, who aches for the orderly, knowable world of the 18th century gentleman scholar, becomes absolutely certain that it is not. The tension between longing and knowledge, between the desire for cosmic significance and the certainty of cosmic indifference, is the engine that drives every story, every entity, every collapsing narrator in the entire corpus. He never intended to build a mythology in the systematic sense. His 1927 essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, is the closest thing he wrote to a manifesto, and its famous opening line, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown," reveals his actual project. Lovecraft was not constructing a franchise. He was engineering a specific emotional response. The recurring names, places, and texts that appear across his stories were atmospheric tools, not world-building blueprints. He wanted readers to feel the pressure of something vast behind the surface of each individual tale, without ever fully defining what that something was. The word he used in his letters was Yog-Sothothery, a self-deprecating term for the interconnected references that gave his stories their cumulative weight. He treated his own mythology with an ironic distance that later systematizers would abandon. His publishing career reinforced this marginality. Lovecraft wrote primarily for Weird Tales, a pulp magazine that paid fractions of a cent per word, and even there he was not always welcome. Farnsworth Wright, the magazine's editor, rejected several of his most important stories, including At the Mountains of Madness. he was never a mainstream success. He revised and ghostwrote for others to survive financially, often earning more from revisions than from his own fiction. He lived on an income that dropped as low as $15 a week. When he died of intestinal cancer on March 15, 1937, at age 46, his total lifetime earnings from fiction were negligible. The mythology that would eventually reshape horror, philosophy, and popular culture worldwide was produced by a man who could barely afford to eat, writing for an audience that numbered, at the time, in the low thousands. This matters because it shaped the work's character. Lovecraft wrote without commercial pressure to simplify, to explain, to resolve. No editor demanded happy endings or coherent cosmologies. No publisher required that the mythology be accessible to casual readers. The mythology's famous ambiguity, its refusal to fully reveal its gods, its insistence that human language cannot capture what its narrators have seen, was partly philosophical conviction and partly the freedom of a writer whom almost nobody was reading. He could afford to be difficult because he had nothing to lose. The obscurity that defined his life became the openness that defined his mythology's afterlife, a body of work so deliberately incomplete that it invited, almost demanded, continuation by other hands. And it is that quality of invitation, rooted in the traditions that preceded Lovecraft, that we must now examine. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror from nothing. He assembled it from a tradition that had been building for over a century, selecting precisely the elements that served his vision and discarding the rest. Understanding what he borrowed and what he transformed is essential to understanding why the mythology feels simultaneously original and ancient, as though it had always existed and Lovecraft merely uncovered it. The Gothic tradition provided the foundation. Anne Radcliffe's late 18th century novels established the architecture of dread, crumbling estates, buried secrets, the past intruding violently on the present. Matthew Lewis's The Monk, 1796, pushed Gothic fiction toward blasphemy and transgression. Edgar Allan Poe refined the tradition into psychological intensity, replacing sprawling castles with the interior spaces of disturbed minds, the telltale heart beating beneath the floorboards, the pendulum descending inch by inch. Lovecraft revered Poe and acknowledged the debt openly throughout his career, but he recognized a limitation in the entire Gothic lineage. Gothic horror was ultimately human-scaled. Its threats were ghosts, madmen, ancestral curses, things rooted in human sin and human consequence. Even at its most extreme, the Gothic assumed that horror originated within the human sphere. Lovecraft wanted something that preceded humanity entirely. He found the first glimpse of it in the work of two writers whose influence on the mythology is difficult to overstate. Arthur Machen, the Welsh author of The Great God Pan, 1894, proposed that behind the surface of pastoral British reality lay something older and fundamentally hostile to human consciousness. Machen's central innovation was the concept of the numinous threat, a force that was neither ghost nor demon, but something ontologically different, something that existed outside the categories of Christian theology and destroyed the mind simply by being perceived. His story, The White People, 1904, describes forbidden rites not as Satanism, but as contact with a reality that predates all human religion. Lovecraft absorbed this principle completely. The entities in his mythology are not demons. They have no relationship to any human moral framework. They are simply other, in a way that the Gothic tradition had never imagined. Robert W. Chambers, in The King in Yellow, 1895, went further in a different direction. His collection introduced a fictional play, also titled The King in Yellow, that drives its readers insane. The play is never quoted at length. Its content is described only through its effects: madness, obsession, civilizational decay. Characters in Chambers' stories are destroyed not by monsters, but by a text. This was the principle Lovecraft would develop most fully. The Necronomicon owes its conceptual DNA to Chambers' unnamed play, and the entire mythos notion of forbidden knowledge as cognitively destructive. Knowledge that harms the knower not through supernatural curse, but through the sheer incompatibility of its content with human sanity, traces back to this single source. Lovecraft read The King in Yellow and understood that a book could be a weapon, that information itself could be lethal, and that the most effective horror might not involve any physical threat at all. Lord Dunsany provided a different ingredient entirely. His invented pantheons, the gods of Pagana, 1905, Time and the Gods, 1906, demonstrated that a modern writer could create gods with the same gravitas as ancient myth. Dunsany's prose was archaic, deliberately cadenced, biblical in rhythm. His gods were capricious and remote, playing games with mortal fates from positions of cosmic detachment. Lovecraft's early Dreamlands fiction is overtly Dunsanian in style, lush, ornamental, populated by exotic cities and enigmatic deities. But where Dunsany's gods were whimsical and ultimately charming in their indifference, Lovecraft's would become terrifying precisely because of that same indifference. He borrowed the form of invented mythology, the idea that a modern writer could construct a pantheon and expect readers to take it seriously, and filled it with a dread that Dunsany never intended. The Dreamland stories represent Lovecraft learning to build worlds. The later mythos stories represent him learning to make those worlds hostile. The scientific context was equally formative, and perhaps more so. Lovecraft came of age during a period of radical cosmological upheaval that has no parallel in human intellectual history. Einstein's general relativity, published in 1915, demolished the stable Newtonian universe and replaced it with a space-time that curved, warped, and behaved in ways that defied intuitive perception. Edwin Hubble's observations in the 1920s revealed that the Milky Way was not the entire cosmos, but one galaxy among billions, a demotion of staggering proportions. The concept of non-Euclidean geometry, curved spatial dimensions that violated every assumption of common sense, entered popular awareness and became, for Lovecraft, a rich metaphor. When his stories describe non-Euclidean geometry in alien architecture, the phrase functions as emotional shorthand. The rules you trust do not apply here. The mathematics was real. Riemannian geometry, hyperbolic space, the curvature of spacetime, these were not science fiction. They were science. Lovecraft's innovation was not to invent the concepts, but to extract from them their emotional implications, and to dramatize those implications as horror. The universe of general relativity is, in a meaningful sense, a Lovecraftian universe, counterintuitive, inhospitable to human perception, governed by principles that the human sensorium cannot directly apprehend. There is one more antecedent that requires careful framing. Lovecraft despised occultism, theosophy, spiritualism, mysticism of every variety. He considered them intellectually contemptible, the refuge of weak minds seeking comfort in superstition. Yet he freely pillaged their structures. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, proposed lost continents, Lemuria, Atlantis, pre-human civilizations stretching back millions of years, and cycles of cosmic history governed by beings of incomprehensible power. The theosophical tradition offered Lovecraft a template: secret histories, hidden knowledge, hierarchies of beings beyond human comprehension, initiated orders guarding dangerous truths, which he adopted wholesale while stripping out every trace of spiritual comfort. His mythology mimics the architecture of esoteric revelation with surgical precision. It promises the same hidden truths. It uses the same narrative structure of progressive initiation into deeper and more dangerous knowledge. It simply makes those truths annihilating rather than enlightening. Where theosophy promised that hidden knowledge would elevate humanity, Lovecraft proposed that hidden knowledge would destroy it. This selective borrowing, Gothic atmosphere from Radcliffe and Poe, ontological threat from Macon, the dangerous text from Chambers, invented pantheons from Dunsany, cosmological scale from Einstein and Hubble, esoteric structure from Blavatsky, explains the mythology's uncanny resonance. Lovecraft built his cosmos from genuine literary traditions, real scientific developments, and authentic occult structures, then inverted their consolations. Readers sense the familiar scaffolding beneath the horror. The mythology feels like it connects to something real because at every structural level it does. What it connects to, however, is not hidden wisdom, but the absence of wisdom, a void dressed in the clothing of revelation. It is this void that Lovecraft would name, with characteristic precision, through a language designed to resist comprehension. One of Lovecraft's most underappreciated achievements is linguistic. He understood, whether consciously or through a writer's instinct, that naming is an act of containment, that to name something is to claim cognitive authority over it, to place it within the grid of human understanding. His mythology's language is therefore designed to resist this authority at every level. The names do not yield. The descriptions do not resolve. The vocabulary itself functions as a barrier between the reader and comprehension, ensuring that the mythology always remains just beyond the reach of full understanding. Consider the word Cthulhu. Lovecraft offered multiple pronunciations in his letters, Cthulhu, roughly, while insisting that no human vocal apparatus could produce the sound correctly. In a 1934 letter to Duane Ramel, he described it as a sort of gurgling that only approximated the original. This is not whimsy or affectation. It is a deliberate ontological statement embedded in phonetics. The entity's name cannot be spoken by the species attempting to speak it. The very act of naming fails before it begins. The mouth cannot form the shape that the concept requires. Other writers in the tradition, Derleth, Bloch, later gaming and film adaptations, would treat Cthulhu as a stable proper noun, rhyming it reliably, printing it on merchandise. Lovecraft treated it as evidence of a gap between human cognition and the thing it attempted to signify. The name is not a label. It is a demonstration of inadequacy. The pattern extends across the mythology's entire lexicon. Azathoth carries echoes of Azathoth, the alchemical term for the universal solvent that dissolves all matter, fused with the ei suffix of ancient Near Eastern deity names, Ashtoreth, Thoth, Behemoth. The word feels ancient because it is assembled from genuinely ancient linguistic components, rearranged into a configuration that belongs to no real tradition. Nyarlathotep came to Lovecraft in a dream, he claimed, fully formed, a name with no traceable etymology, arriving from outside conscious construction. In a letter to Reinhard Kleiner, dated December 14, 1920, He described the dream at length. A friend delivering a letter, describing a figure of that name who was causing panic across the world. The name arrived before the character, before any story, as a pure linguistic object with no referent. Yog-Sothoth suggests Hermetic tradition, Sothoth recalling Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge and writing, while remaining phonetically alien, unassimilable into any known language's phonemic system. Each name borrows enough from real linguistic traditions to feel significant, while remaining ultimately opaque. They invite interpretation without rewarding it. The Necronomicon deserves particular attention as a linguistic construction. Lovecraft attributed it to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, a name he invented as a child around 1903 after reading the Arabian Nights, and retained into his adult fiction without alteration. The author's name was a juvenile invention that Lovecraft never outgrew, which gives it a peculiar psychic weight. It connects the mythology's most important fictional text to the imagination of an 8-year-old boy reading exotic tales in a declining Providence household. The title itself is philologically ambiguous. Lovecraft translated it as an image of the law of the dead from Greek roots, nekros, dead, nomos, law, icon, image. But scholars have debated alternative readings: Book of Dead Names, Book of the Customs of the Dead, Book Concerning the Laws of the Dead. The classicist and Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi has noted that Lovecraft's own Greek was imperfect and the etymology somewhat garbled. This ambiguity is productive. The Necronomicon's title, like its contents, resists stable meaning. It is a text whose name you cannot confidently translate, whose author was mad, whose contents are lethal to comprehend, and whose physical existence is a matter of dispute within the fiction itself. Various stories offer conflicting accounts of how many copies survive and where they are held. Every layer of framing signals danger and instability. Lovecraft's recurring descriptive vocabulary operates on similar principles, though at a different register. Words like cyclopean, eldritch, gibbous, blasphemous, squamous, rugose, and non-Euclidean appear so frequently across his corpus that critics have often dismissed them as verbal tics, signs of a limited stylistic range, or a thesaurus-dependent writer. This reading misses their function entirely. These words are mood instruments, not descriptive precision, tools. Cyclopean does not mean merely large. It means large in a way that implies builders who were not human and construction methods that cannot be explained by known engineering. Eldritch carries no stable denotation. It exists purely as an emotional signal, a word that means strange in the way that Lovecraft's cosmos is strange. Non-Euclidean is borrowed from real mathematics, but functions in the prose as an index of wrongness, of spaces that behave in ways the human brain cannot spatially model. The vocabulary is circular by design. It refers to itself because the things it describes have no external referent in human experience. The words are not windows through which the reader sees the horror. They are walls that communicate the shape of what lies behind them without permitting direct observation. His place names operate differently. They function as psychogeography, creating a parallel New England that overlaps with the real one just enough to produce ontological discomfort. Arkham is modeled on Salem, Massachusetts. Innsmouth draws on the decaying port town of Newburyport. Kingsport echoes Marblehead with its ancient harbor and steep, crooked streets. Dunwich corresponds loosely to various declining hill towns of interior Massachusetts. Miskatonic University is a dark reflection of Brown University, where Lovecraft spent long hours in the John Hay Library without ever having enrolled as a student. These fictional places are mapped onto real New England geography with sufficient precision that readers can almost drive to them, can identify the real roads that would lead to the fictional destinations. The effect is a kind of ontological vertigo. The mythology occupies the same physical space as the real world, separated by only a thin membrane of nomenclature. You cannot visit Arkham, but you can visit the place where Arkham would be if it existed, and the landscape will look uncomfortably correct. This linguistic architecture, unpronounceable entity names, untranslatable text titles, mood vocabulary that resists denotation, place names that almost correspond to real locations, constitutes one of the mythology's most powerful and least discussed mechanisms. It creates a semiotic environment where meaning is perpetually approaching but never arriving. Readers feel they are on the verge of understanding without ever achieving it. This is, of course, precisely the experience of Lovecraft's narrators, who perpetually struggle to articulate what they have seen. The language does not merely describe the epistemological trap of the mythos. It is the trap, enacted at the level of vocabulary and phonetics. And it was through this carefully constructed linguistic environment that Lovecraft would build something unprecedented in modern literature. A fictional mythology that felt, to an extraordinary degree, authentic, as though it had been discovered rather than invented. The Cthulhu Mythos, a buffoonzit term Lovecraft himself never used, preferring the self-deprecating Yog-Sothothery, possesses a quality rare in invented fictional worlds. It feels discovered rather than constructed. Tolkien's Middle-earth, for all its depth and detail, is clearly the product of a single organizing intelligence. Lovecraft's mythology feels like something that existed before anyone wrote it down, a body of knowledge assembled from fragments, riddled with contradictions, incomplete by nature rather than by oversight. This impression is not accidental. Lovecraft employed specific narrative strategies that mimicked the way real mythologies accumulate, and understanding these strategies is fundamental to understanding why the mythology has persisted so powerfully and so strangely. The first strategy was casual cross-reference. Unlike later franchise world-building, where continuity is maintained through editorial oversight, canonical databases, and corporate-style guides, Lovecraft seeded connections between stories through offhand mentions. A character in one tale might reference Miskatonic University in passing, without explanation. The Necronomicon appears on a dusty shelf in one story, is cited in a footnote in another, and is the object of desperate search in a third. A newspaper clipping in The Call of Cthulhu echoes incidents described in The Horror at Red Hook. Investigators in The Dunwich Horror consult the same library resources that appear in The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. No story depends on another for its plot. Each works as a standalone narrative. But the accumulation of shared references, recurring names, institutions, texts, and locations appearing across otherwise unrelated stories, creates the impression of a substrate, a hidden reality that each story glimpses from a different angle, without ever seeing whole. Real mythologies work this way. The Greek myths do not form a single coherent narrative. They are a web of overlapping, sometimes contradictory stories sharing a common world and a common set of figures. The Norse Eddas compile tales from different sources, different centuries, different tellers. Lovecraft replicated this structure intuitively, and the result is a mythology that feels traditional rather than authored. The second strategy was documentary framing. Lovecraft's stories are overwhelmingly presented as found documents, manuscript accounts discovered after the narrator's death, academic papers submitted to scholarly journals, diary entries recovered from abandoned houses, depositions given to police, letters forwarded to third parties. The Call of Cthulhu is assembled from a dead professor's notes. At the Mountains of Madness is framed as a formal report intended to dissuade future Antarctic expeditions. The Whisperer in Darkness builds its horror through a sequence of increasingly desperate letters. The Shadow Out of Time presents itself as the memoir of a professor recovering from a 5-year fugue state. This approach accomplishes two things simultaneously. It establishes plausibility by anchoring the narrative in the conventions of nonfiction. The reader is asked to process the story not as invention, but as evidence. And it positions every narrator as a witness, someone testifying to events that have already happened, already damaged them, already passed beyond their control. The reader never experiences the horror in real time. The reader receives the aftermath, the report filed by someone already broken. The third strategy was deliberate incompleteness. Lovecraft never wrote a cosmological treatise laying out the relationships between his entities. He never produced a comprehensive bestiary, a canonical timeline, or a definitive map of the mythos geography. The Necronomicon is quoted in fragments, never in full. The relationships between entities, Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, shift from story to story, never fully systematized. Is Cthulhu a priest of the outer gods or an independent power? Is Nyarlathotep an avatar of Azathoth or an autonomous agent? The stories suggest different answers at different times. This incompleteness frustrated later systematizers like August Derleth, who attempted to impose taxonomic order on the mythology after Lovecraft's death. But the incompleteness is the point. Complete systems can be mastered. Mastered systems lose their capacity to generate awe and dread. Lovecraft's mythology retains its power to unsettle precisely because it cannot be fully mapped. There is always another corner, another implication, another connection that the reader suspects but cannot confirm. The mythology is larger than any individual story's revelation, and this surplus of suggestion over statement is what gives it its peculiar gravitational pull. The fourth strategy, and perhaps the most consequential for the mythology's long-term survival, was collaborative openness. Lovecraft maintained an extraordinary correspondence network, estimated at over 100,000 letters during his lifetime, making him one of the most prolific letter writers of the 20th century. Through these letters, he encouraged fellow writers to borrow his creations freely, and he borrowed theirs in return. Clark Ashton Smith contributed Tsathoggua, the toad god of Nakai, and the Book of Eibon. Robert E. Howard referenced the Necronomicon in his Conan stories and contributed the Unaussprechlichen Kulten, nameless cults, of von Junst. Robert Bloch created the Star Vampire and the Grimoire de Vermis Mysteries. Frank Belknap Long added Shongyarfaun and the Hounds of Tindalos, beings that exist in the angles of time and can reach any point where angular geometry exists. Lovecraft, in turn, incorporated their inventions into his own work. The mythology was communal from its birth, not a single author's intellectual property, but a shared imaginative space, growing through contribution rather than editorial control. This communal quality mimics another feature of real mythological traditions. The Greek myths were not authored by a single intelligence. They accumulated across centuries, told by different poets, modified by different cultures, compiled by scholars who disagreed about details. The Norse Edda's layer material from oral tradition, Christian-era transcription, and editorial arrangement. Religious scriptures are palimpsests, texts edited and expanded by successive communities of interpreters. Lovecraft's mythology, through its collaborative letter circle network, acquired this same palimpsest quality within his own lifetime. Multiple hands, multiple voices, no single canonical authority. When readers encounter the mythos, they are encountering not one imagination, but a tradition, and traditions carry a weight that individual invention, however brilliant, cannot match. The mythology feels old because it was built by a process that resembles the way old things are actually made. The combined effect of these strategies, cross-reference, documentary framing, incompleteness, collaboration, is a mythology that behaves structurally like a real body of esoteric knowledge. It has primary texts and commentaries. It has orthodox and heterodox interpretations. It has disputed attributions and apocryphal additions. It has the feeling of something that existed before anyone wrote it down and will continue to exist after the last reader closes the last book. This structural authenticity explains one of the mythology's strangest properties, its tendency to escape the boundary of fiction entirely. Hoax editions of the Necronomicon have been published and purchased in earnest. Occultists have incorporated mythos elements into genuine ritual practice. University librarians have received requests for fictional texts filed under real call numbers. Lovecraft built a mythology so formally convincing that reality has, on multiple occasions, failed to distinguish it from the genuine article. Whether this speaks to his craft or to something stranger about the nature of belief itself is a question the mythology raises but refuses to answer, which is, of course, entirely consistent with its design. The mythology gestures toward truths it will not confirm. It suggests connections it will not complete. It creates the impression of vast knowledge while withholding the knowledge itself. It is this architecture of suggestive incompleteness, this careful engineering of the space between what is told and what is implied, that we must now examine from the inside, beginning with the philosophical core that gives the mythology its enduring and genuinely disturbing power. Lovecraft gave his philosophical position a name: cosmicism. The term is his, and it requires precise definition, because it is frequently confused with adjacent positions it superficially resembles. Cosmicism is not pessimism, which holds that suffering outweighs happiness in the balance of experience. It is not nihilism, which denies the existence of objective meaning or value. It is not misanthropy, which expresses contempt for the human species. Cosmicism is indifferentism, the proposition that the universe is not hostile to human life, but simply unaware of it. The distinction matters enormously. Hostility implies attention. Even divine wrath implies that the divine has noticed you. Lovecraft's cosmos offers something far worse than hostility: the total absence of any relationship whatsoever between human existence and the structure of reality. This position has a genealogy worth tracing carefully, because it reveals that Lovecraft was not inventing a philosophy so much as drawing an existing trajectory to its logical conclusion. The Copernican revolution displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, displaced humanity from the center of biological creation. We were not specially made but contingently evolved, one branch among millions on a tree that has no inherent direction. Freud displaced rational consciousness from the center of the mind, suggesting that our motivations are largely opaque to us, driven by unconscious forces we cannot directly perceive. Each displacement was a wound to human self-regard. and each was resisted with proportional intensity. Lovecraft's cosmicism extends this trajectory to its endpoint, the displacement of meaning itself from the structure of reality. Not merely human meaning, but any meaning. The entities that populate the mythos, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Cthulhu, are not evil. They do not oppose humanity. They are simply operating at a scale where human categories of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, significance and insignificance have no application. A glacier is not malicious as it grinds a village to rubble. A supernova is not hostile as it sterilizes a solar system. Lovecraft's gods are natural forces with the shape of living beings, and this is precisely what makes them unbearable to contemplate. The concept of deep time saturates the mythology and provides its temporal architecture. At the Mountains of Madness reveals a civilization on Earth that predates the Cambrian explosion, more than 500 million years before the first fish, the first amphibian, the first mammal. The shadow out of time describes the great race of Yith projecting their minds across billions of years, inhabiting the bodies of species that have not yet evolved and species that went extinct before mammals walked upright. The Call of Cthulhu places Aurelier's construction in an epoch before multicellular life existed on land, before eyes, before limbs, before breath. These are not vague mythological long agos, the once upon a time of fairy tales. Lovecraft draws on actual geological and cosmological timescales with enough specificity to produce a precise emotional effect. The reduction of all human history, every empire, every religion, every philosophy, every war, every love, every artistic achievement, to a thin smear on the surface of time so vast that human civilization registers as barely a statistical anomaly. The pyramids are 4,000 years old. The Elder Things cities are 4 billion years old. The mythology asks what it means to take that ratio seriously. The Dreamlands cycle introduces a related but philosophically distinct concept, the instability of perception itself. In stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, Celiphias, a 1920, and The Silver Key, 1926, dreaming is not metaphor, not hallucination, not psychological symbolism. It is travel. The Dreamlands exist as a parallel reality accessible through trained sleep, with their own geography, ecology, cities, gods, and inhabitants. Randolph Carter moves between waking life and dream as between rooms in a house, and his experiences in both realms have equal ontological weight. Events in the Dreamlands affect his waking life, and vice versa. The philosophical implication is radical and genuinely unsettling if taken seriously. If dream reality possesses the same ontological weight as waking reality, then the distinction between real and unreal, the foundation of empirical thought, the bedrock upon which science, law, and everyday cognition rest, collapses. The mythos does not argue this abstractly in philosophical treatises. It dramatizes it through narrative, through a character who lives in both worlds and finds neither more fundamental than the other. A structural motif recurs across the mythology with the regularity of an architectural principle, binding these philosophical threads into a single pattern, the veil. There is always a boundary between ordinary reality and the truth behind it, and the stories are, in their deepest structure, accounts of that boundary being crossed. In From Beyond, 1920, the boundary is a frequency of electromagnetic radiation. A machine called the Tillinghast resonator stimulates the pineal gland, and allows perception of entities that occupy the same physical space as humans, but are normally invisible. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, it is a set of mathematical equations that permit travel through higher dimensions. A graduate student's research into non-Euclidean calculus opens a literal doorway in the angles of his attic room. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, it is a ritual incantation drawn from the Necronomicon. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, it is genealogy itself, the narrator's own blood. The mechanism varies from story to story. The principle does not. Reality as humans perceive it is a thin surface, and what lies beneath or beyond that surface is not salvation, not transcendence, not the kingdom of heaven. It is contact with something the human mind is architecturally incapable of processing without catastrophic failure. Seeing through the veil does not liberate. It destroys. This is the philosophical engine that drives every element of the mythology, and the entities that embody it are the subject to which we now turn. A necessary disclaimer before cataloging the mythos' inhabitants. Lovecraft never provided a taxonomy. He never drew a hierarchy or organization chart. He never wrote a companion guide distinguishing categories of entity by power level, domain, or cosmic function. Every classification system that exists, the division into outer gods, great old ones, elder gods, lesser old ones, and servitor races, was imposed retrospectively, primarily by August Derleth in the 1940s and 1950s, and later codified by Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game in 1981. What follows is useful as a framework for discussion. It should be understood as a map laid over territory that was deliberately left unmapped by its creator. Azathoth occupies the conceptual center of the mythology, or rather, the conceptual void at the EI center, which is precisely the point. Lovecraft describes Azathoth as the blind idiot god and the nuclear chaos at the heart of infinity, surrounded by a thin, monotonous piping of an amorphous flute and the beating of vile drums. Azathoth is not a character in any narrative sense. It possesses no will, no consciousness, no purpose, no personality. It is the ultimate source of reality, rendered as a mindless, seething, formless mass of energy and chaos. Consider the theological inversion at work here. Every major religious tradition places consciousness, will, or logos at the origin of existence. In the beginning was the Word. Let there be light, the dream of Brahma. Lovecraft places a seizure, an idiot's involuntary spasm. The universe, in the mythos, is not a creation but an accident, the byproduct of mindless cosmic turbulence. This single concept, the blind idiot at the heart of all being, may be the most philosophically devastating idea in the entire mythology. It does not merely deny God, it replaces God with something worse than absence, a presence that is total, foundational, and absolutely without awareness. Yog-Sothoth is Azathoth's complement in the cosmological architecture. Where Azathoth is mindless chaos, Yog-Sothoth is described as coterminous with all time and space, knowing all and seeing all, yet somehow locked outside the universe it pervades. Lovecraft calls it the gate, and the key, and the guardian of the gate. It exists, if the stories are taken together, in all places and all times simultaneously, an entity for which past and future are not sequential, but concurrent. Mathematically minded commentators have compared Yog-Sothoth to a higher dimensional manifold, an entity existing in spatial dimensions beyond the three that human perception can process, appearing to three-dimensional observers as a cluster of iridescent globes or spheres. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, Yog-Sothoth fathers hybrid offspring with a human woman, Lavinia Whately, through a ritual conducted on a hilltop in rural Massachusetts. This union produces one of the mythos's most disturbing implications. The boundary between human and cosmic is not impermeable. It can be crossed. It can be crossed biologically. The result, twin sons, one nearly human in appearance, one invisible and growing to building-sized proportions, is a literalization of what happens when the incompatible scales of human and cosmic are forced into contact. Nyarlathotep is unique among the outer gods because it possesses something that Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth lack entirely: personality. It is a communicator, a messenger, a trickster, a shapeshifter that assumes human form and appears to derive something resembling pleasure from spreading chaos, despair, and madness among human populations. In the prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, it arrives in cities demonstrating scientific instruments that drive audiences to dissolution and civilizational collapse. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, it takes the form of an Egyptian pharaoh, urbane and mocking. Lovecraft described its origin in a dream he had in 1920 that disturbed him so deeply he composed the prose poem immediately upon waking. Nyarlathotep is the face of cosmic indifference that chooses to engage with humanity. And this voluntary engagement is somehow more terrifying than the total disregard of Azathoth. If the universe is genuinely indifferent, why does this one entity bother to interact? The mythology never fully answers this question. The various stories suggest that Nyarlathotep serves as a messenger or soul of the outer gods, that it enacts their will in the material world, that it takes a form of amusement in human suffering. None of these explanations is definitive. The entity remains fittingly the mythos's most ambiguous figure. Cthulhu, despite its cultural ubiquity, the plush toys, the bumper stickers, the presidential campaign, parodies, occupies a subordinate position in the cosmological hierarchy. It is a great old one, not an outer god, powerful beyond human comprehension, certainly, but imprisoned, sleeping, waiting. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, it lies dead dreaming in the sunken city of R'lyeh, somewhere in the South Pacific, and its dreams leak into human consciousness, producing nightmares, artistic frenzy, and cult activity worldwide. When briefly awakened by an earthquake that raises R'lyeh above the waves, Cthulhu is struck by a steamship and reforms, its head re-knitting from the wound. The encounter drives most witnesses insane. Cthulhu became the mythology's public emblem not because it is the most powerful entity, but because it is the most proximate. It is the nearest point of contact between human consciousness and the vast, incomprehensible cosmos beyond. It is the entity that dreams, and whose dreams we receive. It is the threshold figure, and thresholds are inherently more graspable than the infinite spaces that lie beyond them. The mythology's secondary entities deserve attention not merely as a catalog, but as illustrations of specific philosophical principles. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, represents cosmic fertility stripped of all warmth, biological generation as a blind, ceaseless, purposeless process, life producing life without aim, fecundity as horror. The Mygo, fungoid beings from the outer solar system, first appearing in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, are scientists who can surgically remove human brains and preserve them in metal cylinders, conscious and aware, indefinitely. a literalization of disembodied consciousness and an early science-fictional exploration of mind-body separation. The Deep Ones, amphibious humanoids dwelling beneath the ocean, interbreed with coastal human populations, producing hybrids that gradually transform across generations from fully human to fully aquatic. The Elder Things, detailed extensively in At the Mountains of Madness, were Earth's first intelligent inhabitants, arriving from interstellar space hundreds of millions of years ago, building vast cities across the planet's surface, and creating the Shoggoths, protoplasmic, shape-shifting biological servants, through what amounts to genetic engineering. The great race of Yith, described in The Shadow Out of Time, 1934 to 1935, projects its collective mind across time itself, inhabiting the bodies of whatever species currently dominates a given geological era, building libraries of all knowledge gathered from all periods. The Shoggoths require separate attention because they represent something distinct from the cosmic entities. They are not gods, they are tools. Created by the Elder Things as biological servants, infinitely malleable protoplasm capable of forming any organ, any structure, any appendage on command. They were designed to build, to labor, to serve. And they rebelled. Over millions of years, the Shoggoths developed independence, mimicry, and eventually a form of intelligence. Their characteristic cry, Tekeli Li, Tekeli Li, is an imitation of their creator's language, parroted by beings that learn to approximate what they could not originate. The allusion to Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is deliberate, connecting the mythology's deepest terrors back to its literary ancestry. The Shoggoth is Lovecraft's golem, his Frankenstein's monster, his warning about the nature of created servants. Build something powerful enough to be useful, and you have built something powerful enough to destroy you. Build something that imitates intelligence, and you cannot control what it will imitate next. What unifies this entire menagerie, from the blind idiot god to the protoplasmic servant, is a single organizing principle: scalar incompatibility. Every entity in the mythos operates at a scale that is fundamentally mismatched with human existence. Temporal scale, entities that measure their lives in geological epochs. Spatial scale, beings that span dimensions the human eye cannot perceive. Cognitive scale, intelligences that process reality through frameworks for which human thought has no analogs. Biological scale, organisms whose reproduction, metabolism, and morphology violate every assumption of terrestrial biology. The horror is not that these beings are evil. Evil would imply a moral relationship, which would at least grant humanity the dignity of being worth opposing. The horror is that the gap between their mode of existence and ours makes moral categories irrelevant. They do not need to hate us. They merely need to be, and our proximity to their being is sufficient to destroy everything we understand about ourselves. In most horror traditions, madness is a fate worse than death, a punishment, a failure, a mark of weakness. The mad character is the one who could not withstand the pressure, the one whose mind broke under strain. In Lovecraft's mythology, madness performs a fundamentally different function. It is the correct cognitive response to accurate information about the nature of reality. Characters do not go mad because they are weak. They go mad because they are right. This inversion, sanity as ignorance, madness as knowledge, is the psychological core of the entire mythos, and it deserves careful examination. Lovecraft's narrators follow a remarkably consistent profile. They are educated men, professors of medieval metaphysics, antiquarians cataloging family archives, geologists on Antarctic expeditions, linguists deciphering ancient inscriptions, graduate students pursuing doctoral research. They are products of the Enlightenment tradition, trained to observe, document, hypothesize, and reason from evidence. They approach the unknown with precisely the methodology their education has equipped them to use. They research, they read, they follow citations, they consult libraries, they travel to sites of historical interest. And this methodology works. It leads them, step by rational step, to the truth. The problem is that the truth is incompatible with the continued functioning of the human mind. The Enlightenment toolkit, skeptical inquiry, empirical observation, logical deduction, is a precision instrument for self-destruction when applied to the mythos. The more rigorously rational the investigator's approach, the more efficiently and completely it accomplishes his undoing. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is something far more disturbing. A horror story about intellectualism operating exactly as designed, reaching exactly the conclusions it was built to reach, and discovering that those conclusions are unsurvivable. The human cults scattered throughout the mythology, the Cthulhu cult in the Louisiana Bayou, the esoteric order of Dagon in Innsmouth, the hooded worshippers in The Festival, the starry wisdom sect in The Haunter of the Dark, present a different and equally disturbing model of human interaction with the cosmic. These are people who have encountered the truth about the universe and responded not with madness, but with worship. They have chosen to align themselves with forces that are indifferent to them, to organize their communities around the veneration of entities that cannot reciprocate their devotion. The mythology treats this response as comprehensible, even logical in its way, which makes it far more unsettling than if it were treated as simply depraved. The cults answer a genuine human need, the need for meaning, for connection to something larger than individual existence, for the feeling that one's life participates in a cosmic order. That they satisfy this need by worshiping entities that do not and cannot care about them is Lovecraft's bleakest commentary on the religious impulse. The cult members are not fools. They have seen what the narrators will eventually see. They have simply chosen to prostrate themselves before it rather than be destroyed by it. Whether this represents pragmatic survival or the deepest form of self-betrayal is a question the mythology leaves deliberately unresolved. Transformation and hybridization constitute the mythology's most psychologically intimate form of horror, the point where cosmic dread stops being about vast entities in distant spaces and enters the narrator's own body. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, Robert Olmsted discovers that he carries deep one ancestry, that his own body is gradually transforming into something amphibious and inhuman, and that this transformation is not a curse, but his hereditary destiny, written into his genes generations before his birth. In The Dunwich Horror, the Whately twins are the offspring of a human woman and Yog-Sothoth. One appears mostly human, the other is invisible, vast, and eventually reveals itself as a horror that sprawls across the hills of Dunwich. Now, The Thing On, The Doorstep, 1933. Identity itself becomes fluid when an entity repeatedly swaps bodies with a human host, raising the question of where personhood resides if it can be transferred between vessels. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, 1927, a young man researching his ancestors' occult activities gradually becomes that ancestor, his personality overwritten by a consciousness centuries old. These stories locate the cosmic not in distant galaxies or sunken cities, but inside the protagonist's body, heritage, and sense of self. The monster is not approaching from beyond. It is already present, encoded in the narrator's blood, waiting to express itself. What is perhaps most psychologically disturbing about the mythology's treatment of human interaction is what might be called the aftermath pattern. Many Lovecraft stories do not end with the narrator's death. They end with the narrator alive, functional enough to write the account we are reading, but irrevocably changed. The Ea, narrator of the Call of Cthulhu, lives, but lives knowing what he knows, and the story implies his subsequent death was not natural. The narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth lives, and is becoming, and has begun to welcome the becoming. The narrator of The Whisperer in Darkness lives, but suspects everything he believed about the events he witnessed may have been a carefully staged performance by inhuman intelligences. The narrator of At the Mountains of Madness lives, but cannot prevent the next Antarctic expedition, and knows what it will find. Survival, in the mythos, is not victory. It is prolonged exposure to knowledge that cannot be unlearned, a condition of permanent epistemic damage from which no recovery is possible. This treatment of the human mind has implications that extend well beyond genre fiction. Lovecraft was writing, whether he consciously knew it or not, about the limits of psychological resilience in the face of paradigm-shattering information. His narrators experience what Thomas Kuhn would later describe in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, as the crisis state, the moment when accumulated anomalies make the existing conceptual framework untenable, but no new framework has yet emerged to replace it. In Lovecraft, no new framework can emerge. The anomalies are permanent. The old framework, the framework in which humanity is significant, in which the universe is comprehensible, in which rational inquiry leads to truth that empowers rather than destroys, is shattered, and nothing replaces it except the raw, unprocessed awareness of a reality that human cognition was never designed to accommodate. Madness, in this light, is not breakdown. It is the mind running an operating system that has encountered data it cannot process, continuing to function, producing error after error, unable to shut down and unable to integrate the new information into any coherent worldview. And it is precisely this relationship between knowledge and destruction that the mythology examines most explicitly through its most famous symbol. The Necronomicon is not a spellbook. This distinction is critical to understanding its function in the mythology, because popular culture and many later appropriations have treated Lovecraft's fictional grimoire as a magical text, a collection of rituals and incantations in the tradition of the medieval grimoire or the modern Wiccan Book of Shadows. In Lovecraft's own fiction, it operates entirely differently. The Necronomicon is dangerous not because it contains instructions for summoning entities, though it does, incidentally, contain such instructions, but because it contains accurate descriptions of reality. It tells the truth about the cosmos, about the entities that inhabit it, about the history of Earth before human existence, about the geometry of dimensions beyond human perception. And the truth in the Lovecraftian cosmos is lethal. Consider the implications of this carefully. A text is forbidden not because its contents are false. Falsehood is merely error, and error can be corrected through better information. A text is forbidden not because it contains dangerous instructions. Instructions can be ignored, and access can be restricted. The Necronomicon is forbidden because its contents are true, and this truth is incompatible with the functional operation of the human mind. Every fact in it corresponds to something real within the mythology. The descriptions of the old ones are accurate. The accounts of pre-human history are correct. The mathematical formulations that describe higher dimensional spaces actually work. The danger is not deception, not manipulation, not supernatural curse. The danger is education. The Necronomicon is the most dangerous textbook ever written because its curriculum is reality, and reality, fully apprehended, is unsurvivable. This inverts the entire Western intellectual tradition with remarkable precision and thoroughness. Since the Enlightenment, since Bacon's Novum Organum, 1620, since the founding assumptions of the scientific revolution, the dominant assumption of Western thought has been that knowledge liberates. More information produces better outcomes. Education elevates the individual and the species. Science protects against superstition. Research reveals truth, and truth makes us free. The entire architecture of the modern university, the public library, the scientific journal, the popular science book, the educational documentary rests on this assumption, that knowing more is inherently better than knowing less. Lovecraft's mythology proposes the opposite with complete seriousness and sustained argumentative force. That there exist categories of truth which are cognitively destructive, that certain knowledge is inherently unsafe regardless of the knower's intentions or preparation, and that the pursuit of understanding, humanity's most celebrated, intellectual endeavor, can function as a mechanism of annihilation when it encounters information scaled beyond human cognitive architecture. This is not anti-intellectualism. Lovecraft was himself an obsessive reader, researcher, and synthesizer of knowledge, a man who spent his life in libraries. It is something more disturbing, a horror story told from inside the intellectual tradition, using its own methods to demonstrate its own limits, written by someone who loved knowledge and feared where it led. The epistemological arc of a typical Lovecraft story follows a pattern so consistent it constitutes a formal structure, almost a liturgy. The narrator begins with curiosity, an unexplained event, an inherited document, a scholarly interest, a strange footnote in an old book. Curiosity leads to research. Research produces preliminary findings that are strange but explicable within existing frameworks. Unusual geological formations, peculiar local customs, an oddly persistent legend. Further research produces findings that strain conventional explanation. At a critical threshold, the accumulated evidence becomes impossible to reconcile with the narrator's existing understanding of reality. The framework collapses, the narrator sees, and seeing destroys. Each stage of this arc feels rational from within. The narrator makes defensible decisions at every point. No single step is irrational. There is no moment where a reasonable person would stop and turn back, because each individual finding is manageable. It is only the accumulation that proves fatal. The trap is seamless because it is built from the same materials as legitimate scholarly inquiry. Lovecraft understood, intuitively and with devastating fictional precision, that the structure of genuine discovery and the structure of catastrophic revelation are identical from the inside. You cannot tell them apart until it is too late. Language itself becomes a site of failure in the mythology. Lovecraft's narrators perpetually struggle to describe what they have encountered. Phrases recur across the corpus with the regularity of a verbal tick that is actually a thematic principle. Words cannot convey. No human language can adequately express. The geometry was all wrong, indescribable, unnameable, of such a nature that I cannot bring myself to set it down. Critics have often treated this as a weakness of Lovecraft's prose, an inability to render the visual, a lazy reliance on abstraction rather than concrete detail. But thematically, it is one of his most deliberate and defensible choices. Human language evolved to describe human-scale reality. It developed vocabulary for objects, emotions, spatial relationships, and temporal sequences as experienced by a primate species on a mid-sized rocky planet orbiting a medium-sized star. The mythos proposes that reality extends far beyond this experiential range, into zones where human language simply has no reference, not because the language is deficient, but because the language is correctly calibrated for a scale of reality that turns out to be parochial. The narrator's inability to describe what they see is not a failure of articulation. It is an accurate report of a genuine cognitive limitation encountered at the boundary of the humanly thinkable. The mythology's deepest proposition is not that gods exist, or that they are terrible, or that the universe is indifferent. It is that there may be truths that are genuinely, structurally, permanently incompatible with human flourishing, that the universe might contain correct information, factually accurate, empirically verifiable, logically consistent, that cannot be safely known by the kind of mind that humans possess. That the boundary between the knowable and the unknowable is not a frontier to be conquered through better instruments and braver inquiries, but a wall that protects as much as it confines, a wall whose breaching does not liberate, but exposes. Lovecraft does not argue this position abstractly in essays or philosophical treatises. He dramatizes it through dozens of specific narratives in which specific characters make specific, defensible, rational discoveries, each one a step closer to an understanding that will unmake them. The reader follows the same path. The reader makes the same rational assessments, and the reader arrives alongside the narrator at a conclusion the mythology has been preparing from the beginning. It would have been better not to know. It is this principle, enacted, tested, and demonstrated across the full corpus, that we must now trace through the mythology's major literary manifestations. The mythology did not arrive fully formed. It accreted slowly across a decade of stories that began as isolated experiments in atmosphere and gradually revealed themselves, even to their author, as explorations of a shared underlying reality. Lovecraft's earliest weird fiction contains fragments, images, phrases, and atmospheric principles that would later coalesce into the interconnected cosmos known retroactively as the Cthulhu Mythos. Tracing these early appearances reveals something important about how the mythology actually developed. Not through planning, not through world building in the modern franchise sense, but through repetition, variation, and the gradual discovery that individual stories were circling the same set of ideas like moths around a light source they could sense but not see. Dagon, written in 1917 and published in The Vagrant in 1919, is the prototype. A shipwrecked sailor adrift in the Pacific after escaping a German sea raider during the First World War finds himself stranded on a vast expanse of ocean floor recently thrust above the surface by seismic activity. The landscape is a nightmare of black mire and dead marine life exposed to air for the first time in geological ages. He discovers a monolith, a great stone carved with images of creatures that are part human, part fish, scaled beyond anything human hands could have built. And then he sees something alive in the water, vast, groping, impossibly large, embracing the monolith with arms that belong to no known species. He escapes. But the story's final lines reveal he is writing from a cheap room, addicted to morphine, hearing something at his door. The story compresses, in a few pages, Every element the mythology would later expand across hundreds of thousands of words. The lone narrator, the ancient artifact, the oceanic unknown, the glimpse of something operating at a scale beyond human comprehension, and the psychological aftermath that constitutes its own ongoing horror. The monster in Dagon barely appears. The narrator's disintegration is the story's true subject. Nyarlathotep, composed in 1920 as a prose poem barely 2 pages long, emerged directly from a dream. Lovecraft described the dream in a letter to Reinhard Kleiner. A friend delivered an envelope containing a message about a figure named Nyarlathotep who was traveling from city to city, demonstrating strange instruments in public lectures, and everywhere he went, society dissolved into chaos. The piece has no conventional plot. It is pure atmosphere. A vision of civilizational collapse presided over by an entity that seems to enjoy the disintegration it causes. People attend Nyarlathotep's demonstrations and emerge changed, diminished, drifting through darkened streets toward some unspecified dissolution. The prose poem established, in miniature, the defining characteristics of its title figure: agency, personality, something resembling malicious amusement, and direct engagement with human populations. Nyarlathotep would later become the most psychologically complex entity in the pantheon, but here, at its origin, the essential traits are already present. The Nameless City, 1921, introduced 2 elements that would become load-bearing pillars of the entire mythology. The first is the couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," attributed to Abdul al-Hazred and the Necronomicon, and destined to become the mythology's most quoted passage. The second is the concept of the pre-human city, buried beneath desert sands, built by a reptilian race that preceded humanity by millions of years. The narrator crawls through tunnels that narrow as they descend, designed for bodies shaped differently than his, bodies that were low and broad and moved on multiple limbs, and discovers murals depicting a civilization's rise and decline across geological epochs. The story established what would become the mythology's signature temporal maneuver, the revelation that human history is a footnote to histories far older, far stranger, and far more significant than our own. The Hound, 1922, and The Festival, 1923, thickened the web of cross-reference that would eventually become the mythology's structural skeleton. The Hound mentions the Necronomicon by name and attributes it to Abdul al-Hazred. The Festival introduces Kingsport, Lovecraft's fictional analog of Marblehead, Massachusetts, and depicts a subterranean ceremony involving hooded figures, pre-human rites conducted in tunnels beneath a congregational church, and a narrator who realizes that the celebrants beneath the hoods are not entirely human. Their faces are waxen, their eyes are wrong. Neither story is considered among Lovecraft's finest achievements in terms of prose craft. Their importance is structural and cumulative. They are the stitches that began connecting individual tales into a shared fabric, the moments where isolated nightmares began suggesting a common source. The same forbidden book appearing in different stories, the same architectural style recurring in different cities, the same species of dread manifesting in different New England towns. Then came The Call of Cthulhu, written in the summer of 1926 and published in Weird Tales in February 1928. It is the foundational text, the story that transformed scattered atmospheric elements into something recognizable as a mythology. Its 3-part mosaic structure is a masterpiece of indirect narration. The first section follows Francis Wayland Thurston as he assembles the papers of his recently deceased grand-uncle, Professor George Gamble Angel, an emeritus professor of Semitic languages at Brown University. Angel had been researching a strange bas-relief carved by a young sculptor during a period of disturbing nightmares. Nightmares shared simultaneously by sensitive individuals worldwide. The second section recounts a police inspector's 1907 raid on a cult in the Louisiana bayou. Worshippers dancing around a monstrosity in a swamp clearing, chanting phrases in no known human language, gathered around a statuette identical to the sculptor's bas-relief. The third section presents the testimony of a Norwegian sailor, Gustav Johansen, who in 1925 encountered an island risen from the Pacific, the corpse city of R'lyeh, and the entity that emerged from it. No single narrator witnesses the full picture. The truth is assembled from fragments: a sculptor's nightmare, a professor's notes, a police report, a sailor's deposition, each originating from a different continent, a different social class, a different mode of evidence. Thurston's realization that these fragments connect, that the cult is global, that the dreams are universal, that the entity is real, and sleeping and dreaming and influencing human consciousness through its sleep, comes not through direct experience, but through scholarship. He reads his way into the horror. He cross-references his way to the truth. And the story's quiet, devastating final implication, buried in the opening paragraph's mention of Thurston's own unexplained death, is that assembling this knowledge was itself lethal. Someone, or something, does not want these fragments connected. The mythology had found its form: fragmentary, documentary, cumulative, and self-protective. The truth resists its own assembly. Lovecraft considered At the Mountains of Madness his most important work. Written in February and March of 1931, rejected by Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright as too long, and eventually published in a serialized and abridged form in Astounding Stories in February-March and April 1936. It represents his most ambitious attempt to fuse cosmic horror with the conventions of the scientific expedition narrative. The story is modeled explicitly on real Antarctic exploration accounts: Shackleton's South, 1919, Scott's Journals, the bird expeditions of the late 1920s, and Lovecraft researched the geography, meteorology, glaciology, and logistics of polar travel with the obsessive thoroughness he brought to every project. The realism of the expedition's outward form is not incidental. It is the delivery mechanism for everything that follows. The more authentic the scientific framework, the more devastating its collapse. The narrator, William Dyer, is a professor of geology at Miskatonic University. He is writing an urgent report to dissuade a planned scientific expedition from returning to the Antarctic interior, and this report constitutes the entire novella. The urgency is established immediately. Something was found on the previous expedition that makes a return journey catastrophically dangerous, and Dyer is racing to make the case before institutional momentum carries the new expedition past the point of recall. An advance party led by Professor Lake, a biologist, had discovered fossils in the transantarctic mountains that could not be classified within any known biological taxonomy. Barrel-shaped organisms with five-pointed radial symmetry, wing-like appendages folded at rest, features suggesting attributes of both plant and animal biology, and a cellular structure that defied standard histological analysis. Lake's radio transmissions grow increasingly excited. He calls the specimens the most important discovery in science, then abruptly cease. When Dyer and a graduate student named Danforth fly to Lake's camp, they find it destroyed. Sled dogs slaughtered, equipment wrecked, several of Lake's specimens missing. The human dead have been surgically dissected with a precision that suggests scientific method rather than animal predation. Someone, or something, had examined them with the same clinical detachment Lake had applied to the fossils. What follows is the novella's centerpiece, occupying roughly half its total length. Dyer and Danforth's exploration of a vast, abandoned city discovered beyond an impossibly high mountain range that the expedition had not previously detected. The city is millions of years old. Its architecture defies human engineering conventions. Cyclopean blocks fitted without mortar, streets designed for beings with radial rather than bilateral symmetry, buildings whose interior geometry reflects spatial assumptions alien to human bodily experience. And its walls are covered with bas-relief murals that tell a story. Lovecraft devotes thousands of words to these murals, and this extended passage is among the most remarkable sustained sequences in his entire corpus. The murals depict the elder things, the barrel-shaped beings Lake had discovered as fossils, arriving on primordial Earth from interstellar space, building civilizations, engineering the first terrestrial life forms as food and amusement, warring with the spawn of Cthulhu, and later with the My-Go from the outer solar system, and creating the Shoggoths as biological servants through a form of cellular manipulation. The murals trace this history across hundreds of millions of years. The Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic, each geological period that human paleontology has cataloged, revealed to be merely the backdrop to someone else's civilization, someone else's rise and decline. The critical philosophical moment comes when Dyer, studying these murals with the trained eye of a geologist accustomed to reading stratigraphic records, arrives at a recognition that disturbs him more profoundly than any physical danger. They were men. The elder things, despite their utterly alien biology, five-fold radial symmetry, barrel torsos, starfish-shaped heads, wing-like structures, were scientists, artists, architects, engineers. They conducted experiments. They created representational art. They had politics and social conflict and periods of cultural flourishing and decline. They built universities. Dyer identifies with them. He empathizes with them. And this empathy is the story's deepest philosophical stroke. It generates sympathy for the entirely inhuman while simultaneously demolishing human exceptionalism. If the elder things were men, if intelligence, curiosity, aesthetic sensibility, and the drive to understand the cosmos are not uniquely human properties, but patterns that recur across species separated by billions of years and billions of light years, then what exactly is special about us? The answer the story implies, without stating, is nothing. We are one iteration of a pattern that has repeated before and will repeat again, each iteration convinced of its own uniqueness, each eventually supplanted. The climax descends into the tunnels beneath the city, where Dyer and Danforth encounter a surviving Shoggoth, a protoplasmic mass of enormous proportions covered in temporary eyes that form and dissolve across its surface, rolling through the tunnels like a subway train and emitting the cry, "Tekeli-li, Tekeli-li." The allusion to Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is deliberate and structurally significant. Lovecraft explicitly connects his Antarctic horror to Poe's, placing his mythology within a literary lineage at the moment of greatest terror. The Shoggoth is pursuing not with malice, but with the blind mimetic reflex of a created servant that has outlived its creators and continued operating without purpose or direction, imitating their language, maintaining their tunnels, functioning without function. Dyer and Danforth escape by air, flying back over the mountain range. But the story does not end with their escape. It ends with Dyer's account of what Danforth saw when he looked backward toward the higher mountains. The mountains beyond the mountains of madness, peaks that the elder things themselves had depicted in their murals with evident terror. Something existed beyond even the elder thing's comprehension. Danforth will not say what he saw. He has broken down. He mutters disconnected phrases, the original, the eternal, the undying, that Dyer cannot assemble into coherent description. The story closes with Dyer's increasingly desperate plea to cancel the new Antarctic expedition because the horror is layered. Behind the mountains of madness lie higher mountains. Behind the alien civilization lies something that terrified the aliens. Behind every revelation lies a deeper revelation, and the regression is, by implication, infinite. There is no bottom. There is no final answer. There is only the next level of understanding, and each level is worse than the last. If at the mountains of madness is the mythology's most ambitious intellectual achievement, the shadow over Innsmouth is its most psychologically devastating. Written in late November and early December 1931, the same extraordinary year that produced Mountains, and published as a small press chapbook by Visionary Publishing Company in 1936, it is Lovecraft's only story published as a standalone book during his lifetime. It is also the story in which the mythology's horror becomes most intimate, most personal, and most impossible to distance or externalize. This is the story where the cosmic enters the body. The surface narrative is deceptively accessible, almost palpably wrong. Buildings crumbling into palpably wrong. Buildings crumbling into their foundations, streets near empty at midday. The remaining inhabitants displaying a peculiar physical degeneration that locals call the Innsmouth look. Bulging, unblinking eyes, flattened noses, rough, grayish skin with a suggestion of scaling, narrow, receding skulls, thick, wrinkled necks. The residents are hostile to outsiders and reticent about the town's history. The once prosperous shipping and fishing industries have collapsed into insularity. There is a pervasive smell of fish, clinging to every surface, impossible to escape. Lovecraft renders Innsmouth with the specificity of a social realist. The architecture, the economic decline, the demographic hollowing out, before introducing any supernatural element. The town is horrifying before it is horrifying in the genre sense. The story's first great set piece is the monologue of Zadok Allen, the town drunk, whom Olmsted plies with bootleg whiskey in exchange for information. Allen's account, delivered in thick Yankee dialect over several unbroken pages, tells the history of Captain Obed Marsh, an Innsmouth sea captain who, during his voyages to the South Pacific in the 1840s, made contact with an island civilization that worshipped aquatic beings called the Deep Ones. The islanders prospered. Abundant fish, gold jewelry of alien design, protection from enemies. Marsh brought the worship back to Innsmouth and brokered a pact. The people of Innsmouth would interbreed with the Deep Ones, producing hybrid offspring that would begin life appearing human and gradually transform, across decades, into fully aquatic beings capable of living beneath the ocean indefinitely. In return, the Deep Ones would provide fish and gold. Allen describes the rituals at Devil Reef, the DUE sacrifices, the gradual transformation of the town's population, the establishment of the esoteric order of Dagon to replace the town's Christian churches. The monologue is simultaneously unreliable. Allen is drunk, terrified, possibly delusional, certainly not a disinterested witness, and entirely coherent in its internal logic. Lovecraft gives the reader no stable interpretive ground. The account could be the ravings of a mind destroyed by alcoholism and isolation, or it could be an accurate history delivered by the only person willing to speak. The story refuses to confirm either possibility until it is too late for the distinction to matter. The second set piece is the pursuit through Innsmouth at night. Olmsted, attempting to leave town after being forced to stay overnight in a decrepit hotel, discovers that his room's locks have been tampered with and that figures are gathering in the streets below. What follows is Lovecraft's most sustained and effective action sequence. A.T.E. nighttime chase through decaying streets, over rooftops, through abandoned buildings, down fire escapes, with the sounds of pursuit growing closer and the pursuers gradually revealing themselves in glimpses and silhouettes as not entirely human. Their movements are wrong. Their bodies bend in ways human anatomy does not permit. They make sounds, croaking, guttural vocalizations that have no human equivalent. Lovecraft, not a writer generally celebrated for physical tension or kinetic prose, achieves something remarkable in this sequence. The intellectual horror of the mythology translated into animal terror. The body's primal knowledge that it is being hunted by something that should not exist. The sequence works because it grounds cosmic horror in the immediate, physical experience of running for your life through a town that has become a trap. And because the pursuers are never fully seen, always half hidden by shadow, always at the edge of perception, always more suggested than shown. The government response provides a brief, illusory restoration of rational order. After Olmsted reports his experience, federal authorities conduct a large-scale raid on Innsmouth. Torpedoes fired at Devil Reef, depth charges dropped in the harbor, mass arrests, the town largely demolished. This intervention initially appears to reassert institutional control. The state has identified the threat, deployed its resources, and neutralized the danger. But the story makes clear, quietly and without emphasis, that the raid failed. The Deep Ones were not eradicated. Their submarine civilization, Yhantley, a city beneath the ocean far older than Innsmouth, is vast, ancient, and entirely beyond the reach of human military technology. The government destroyed a surface settlement. The ocean remains. The Deep Ones continue. Institutional power, the last refuge of rationalist control, proves as inadequate against the cosmic threat as individual sanity. The torpedoes are as futile as the narrator's reason. Then comes the ending, which retroactively transforms every element of the story that preceded it. Olmsted, researching his own genealogy in the months following his escape, discovers that he is descended from the Marsh family. He carries Innsmouth blood. The Deep One heritage that he observed with revulsion in the town's inhabitants is his own heritage, coded into his DNA, waiting to express itself. The physical changes have already begun. His features are shifting. His skin is changing texture. He is dreaming of submarine cities and vast, dark spaces beneath the waves. And the story's final paragraph is the mythology's most disturbing passage. Not because it depicts violence or cosmic horror in the conventional sense, but because it depicts acceptance. Olmsted writes that he is learning to embrace his transformation, that the underwater city of Yhantley calls to him with increasing insistence that he will rescue his similarly transforming cousin from the asylum where she has been confined, and that together they will swim down to that brooding wonder and dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. The horror is not that the narrator is destroyed. The horror is that the narrator wants what is happening to him. Identity itself, the feeling of being human, of belonging to the human world, of experiencing human desires and human revulsions, has dissolved, and what has replaced it feels, to the narrator, like liberation, like homecoming, like waking from a dream of being human into the reality of being something else. Any honest analysis must address the story's relationship to Lovecraft's extensively documented racial anxieties, because in The Shadow over Innsmouth, these anxieties are not subtext. They are structure. The fear of miscegenation, of hereditary taint, of pure bloodlines corrupted by contact with the foreign and the inhuman. These are the story's load-bearing elements. The Innsmouth look is a horror of mixed heritage. The town's decline tracks directly from interbreeding with a non-human species. The narrator's crisis is the discovery that his bloodline is not what he believed, that alien ancestry is hidden in his family tree, expressing itself across generations. Lovecraft's personal racism, documented extensively in his letters, and extreme even by the standards of his era, informs the story's deepest mechanisms. Acknowledging this does not invalidate the story's literary power. Innsmouth remains one of the most psychologically complex horror narratives in the English language. But it does mean that the story's horror operates in part through the mobilization of genuinely harmful prejudices about racial purity, hereditary contamination, and the threat of the foreign. The mythology's power and its creator's pathology are, in this story, the same substance viewed from different angles. Inseparable, uncomfortable, demanding engagement rather than dismissal. Lovecraft died on March 15, 1937, in Providence, of intestinal cancer complicated by Bright's disease, at the age of 46. He was buried in the Phillips family plot at Swan Point Cemetery. The mythology did not die with him. What happened next is a story about preservation, transformation, distortion, and a philosophical betrayal so well-intentioned and so consequential that it reshaped the public understanding of Lovecraft's cosmos for decades. August Derleth is the indispensable and deeply problematic figure at the center of this story. Within months of Lovecraft's death, Derleth partnered with Donald Wandre to found Arkham House, a small press based in Sauk City, Wisconsin, dedicated specifically to publishing Lovecraft's collected fiction in hardcover. This was an act of literary preservation, without which the mythology might genuinely have vanished into pulp magazine back issues and been forgotten. The Outsider and Others, 1939, the first Arkham House volume, collected Lovecraft's major works between hard covers for the first time, printing 1,268 copies. Derleth's decades-long dedication to keeping Lovecraft in print through the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, when critical and commercial interest was minimal, was tireless, sincere, and historically indispensable. The mythology survived its creator's death largely because one man in Wisconsin refused to let it disappear. But Derleth also reinterpreted the mythology, and his interpretation imposed a framework fundamentally alien to Lovecraft's philosophical intent. Derleth was a devout Catholic. He understood cosmic narratives through the lens of moral dualism, good versus evil, order versus chaos, light versus darkness. He categorized the mythos entities into elemental groups. Cthulhu associated with water, Cthugha, Derleth's own invention, with fire, Ithaqua with air, Nyarlathotep with earth. More significantly, he introduced elder gods, benevolent cosmic forces actively opposed to the Great Old Ones, engaged in an eternal war for the fate of the cosmos. This imposed a Manichaean structure, a battle between good and evil cosmic powers, with humanity as a meaningful participant in the conflict, onto a mythology whose entire philosophical point was the absence of any such moral architecture. Lovecraft's cosmos has no good gods. It has no cosmic war. It has no interest in humanity's moral condition. It has only indifference at scales that make morality meaningless. Derleth's systematization made the mythology more accessible, more narratively conventional, and more emotionally manageable. It also hollowed out its philosophical core. For decades, a significant portion of the reading public encountered Lovecraft's cosmos through Derleth's moral filter without realizing the distortion, without understanding that the mythology they were reading had been fundamentally domesticated. Clark Ashton Smith, by contrast, expanded the mythology in directions that honored its original spirit, while adding dimensions Lovecraft himself never explored. Smith's Hyperborean cycle, set on the last northern continent during the waning of the final ice age, introduced Tsathoggua, a toad-like deity of immense laziness and vast antiquity, and the Book of Ibon, another fictional grimoire that joined the Necronomicon in the mythology's growing library of dangerous texts. Smith's prose was more ornate than Lovecraft's, more sensual, more decadent, more luxuriously morbid, influenced by Baudelaire and the French symbolists, where Lovecraft was influenced by Poe and Dunsany. His humor was darker, his eroticism more explicit, his willingness to depict physical horror more direct. But his philosophical alignment with Lovecraft was close. Smith's cosmos was equally indifferent, equally vast, equally hostile to human significance. His Zothic cycle, set in Earth's last continent as the sun dies, is among the most purely nihilistic bodies of fiction produced in the 20th century. His contribution enriched the mythology's texture and tonal range without distorting its meaning. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, presents a fascinating paradox. Howard's fiction is philosophically opposed to Lovecraft's in almost every significant respect. Where Lovecraft's protagonists are passive intellectuals destroyed by knowledge they cannot unlearn, Howard's are active barbarian warriors who impose their will on hostile environments through strength, cunning, and sheer vitality. Where Lovecraft's cosmos renders human agency meaningless, Howard's celebrates it. Yet Howard incorporated mythos elements into his own work with Lovecraft's enthusiastic encouragement. References to the Necronomicon, allusions to pre-human civilizations, entities that echo Lovecraft's pantheon in outline, if not in tone. The mythology proved capacious enough to contain a worldview diametrically opposed to its creators. This adaptability, the capacity to function as backdrop, atmosphere, and reference system within radically different narrative frameworks and philosophical commitments, would prove to be one of the mythology's most important properties in the decades ahead. It is a framework, not a doctrine. The second and third generations of mythos writers expanded the geography, the tonal range, and the cultural reach. Robert Bloch, who had corresponded with Lovecraft as a teenager and received permission to kill a character based on Lovecraft in a story, Lovecraft reciprocated by killing a Bloch-based character in The Haunter of the Dark, brought the mythos into psychological horror territory that anticipated his later masterwork, Psycho, 1959. Ramsey Campbell transplanted the mythology to England's Severn Valley, creating a distinctly British Lovecraftian atmosphere of damp, provincial decay, and institutional rot. Colin Wilson in The Mind Parasites, 1967, pushed the mythology toward philosophical science fiction. Each expansion demonstrated the same principle. The mythology was a framework that could be relocated, reinterpreted, and extended without losing its essential character. Its sense that something vast and incomprehensible lurks just outside the frame of any given narrative. The most transformative expansion came not from literature, but from gaming. Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, published by Chaosium in 1981, did more to codify the mythology for popular consumption than any single literary work published after Lovecraft's death. The game required mechanical precision, where Lovecraft had cultivated deliberate vagueness. Entities needed statistics, spells needed rules, locations needed maps, and, most significantly, sanity needed a numerical system. The sanity points mechanic, in which characters possess a finite pool of mental stability that decreases measurably upon each encounter with mythos phenomena, formalized what Lovecraft had left impressionistic. It also introduced millions of players to the mythology who might never have read the original stories. The influence flowed both ways. Later literary treatments of the mythos frequently reflect the categories, hierarchies, and mechanical distinctions established by the game rather than by Lovecraft's own more fluid and contradictory fiction. The mythology had acquired a canonical structure, something Lovecraft deliberately avoided, and this structure, for better and worse, became the default framework through which most people now encounter his creation. Thomas Ligotti represents the philosophical endgame of the tradition Lovecraft began. His fiction, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1986, Grimscribe, 1991, Teatro Grotesco, 2006, and especially his non-fiction treatise, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, take Lovecraftian cosmicism to its logical terminus, a genuine, sustained philosophical argument for antinatalism and pessimism, grounded in the premise that consciousness itself is a malignant aberration, that existence is an affliction rather than a gift, and that the horror Lovecraft depicted in fiction is simply an accurate description of reality without the fictional frame. Ligotti does not write Lovecraftian pastiche. He writes as though cosmicism were literally true and draws the consequences. Along with writers like Laird Barron, whose fiction blends Lovecraftian cosmic horror with rural noir, and the broader New Weird movement, represented by writers like China Miéville and Jeff Vandermeer, Ligotti demonstrated that the mythology had become something more than a shared fictional universe. It had become a philosophical tradition, a set of premises about the nature of existence capable of generating not only stories, but genuine intellectual arguments, not only entertainment, but a worldview. The mythology had outgrown fiction entirely, and it is this broader cultural and psychological afterlife that demands our final examination. The strangest property of Lovecraft's mythology is not its content, but its behavior. Fictional systems, as a general rule, remain within their boundaries. They are understood as inventions, consumed as entertainment, and filed in the cultural memory under their correct category: fiction. Readers of Tolkien do not search for the Shire on real maps. No one has attempted to enroll at Hogwarts through a legitimate university admissions process. These mythologies are beloved, elaborated, and occasionally obsessed over, but they remain securely fictional. The Cthulhu Mythos has not behaved this way. On multiple documented occasions, it has crossed the line between invented and actual in ways that demand explanation rather than dismissal. The Necronomicon is the primary and most instructive case. In the early 1970s, pranksters inserted catalog cards for the Necronomicon into the card catalogs of university libraries across the United States, UC Berkeley, Yale, the University of Michigan, among others. Librarians received interlibrary loan requests for a book that did not exist. In 1977, a volume titled The Simon Necronomicon was published by Avon Books, not a specialty occult press, but a major mass-market paperback publisher. The book was available in airport bookshops and drugstore spinning racks. It claimed to be a translation of an ancient Sumerian text and bore no meaningful relationship to Lovecraft's invention, drawing instead on Mesopotamian mythology and contemporary ceremonial magic traditions. It has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. Practicing occultists have incorporated its rituals into genuine magical practice. The text Lovecraft invented in the 1920s as a symbol of knowledge too dangerous to read, a fictional grimoire whose very existence within his stories signals danger, has become a real book that real people purchase with real money and use in real rituals they sincerely believe to be efficacious. The fictional frame has not merely cracked, it has, for a measurable segment of the population, dissolved entirely. And the dissolution did not require anyone to believe that Lovecraft was channeling genuine ancient knowledge. It required only that the form of the Necronomicon, its presentation as a dangerous hidden text of enormous antiquity containing truths the uninitiated cannot safely encounter, be sufficiently congruent with the form of genuine esoteric texts that the distinction became, in practice, irrelevant. The bloop offers a different category of boundary erosion, not human invention escaping into belief, but reality briefly rhyming with fiction in a way that cannot be explained away as coincidence. In 1997, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded an ultra-low frequency underwater sound in the South Pacific at coordinates approximately 50 degrees south, 100 degrees west. These coordinates fall remarkably close to the location Lovecraft assigned to the sunken city of R'lyeh in The Call of Cthulhu, 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west. The sound was massive, detectable by sensors, separated by over 5,000 kilometers, and initially unexplained. It was eventually attributed to cryogenic processes, large icebergs fracturing and grinding against the Antarctic continental shelf. The explanation was satisfying from a scientific standpoint. It did nothing to diminish the cultural frisson. For several years, the bloop existed in the public imagination as a possible biological signal from something enormous lurking in the deep Pacific, and Lovecraft's coordinates hung over the phenomenon like an uncanny footnote that reality had not authorized. Similar rhymes between the mythology and subsequent discovery have accumulated over the decades. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, beginning in the mid-1990s, revealed a monumental stone complex built approximately 11,600 years ago, thousands of years before the supposed invention of agriculture, by a civilization that left no written records and no other monumental architecture. A structure of enormous sophistication, built by people who should not, according to existing archaeological models, have been capable of building it, then deliberately buried and abandoned for reasons unknown. The resonance with the mythos's pre-human ruins is uncomfortable in its precision. Deep-sea exploration has revealed organisms, giant squid, tube worms clustered around hydrothermal vents in lightless depths, bioluminescent creatures at Hadal pressures that visually resemble Lovecraftian descriptions closely enough to generate memes, popular articles, and a persistent cultural association between the deep ocean and cosmic horror. None of this constitutes evidence that Lovecraft was right in any literal sense. All of it constitutes evidence that his mythology is calibrated to the kinds of discoveries reality actually produces, that he built his fiction close enough to the contours of the unknown, that real discoveries periodically land in the space he prepared for them. The Slender Man phenomenon, beginning in 2009, provides perhaps the most instructive modern parallel. Created deliberately as a fictional entity by Eric Knudsen on the Something Awful internet forums as part of a Photoshop contest, Slender Man was understood by its creator and its initial audience as an explicit invention, a collaborative fiction experiment. Within 5 years, it had generated thousands of derivative works, multiple independent mythological traditions with conflicting lore, a feature film, and, in May 2014, a real-world stabbing in Waukesha, Wisconsin, committed by two 12-year-old girls who claimed to be acting to appease the entity. A fiction known to be fiction had produced real-world behavioral consequences indistinguishable from those produced by genuine beliefs. The parallel to the Necronomicon is structural. Both entities are known to be invented, both have generated communities that treat them as operationally real, both have or produced measurable effects in the physical world. This raises a question the mythology itself would appreciate for its irreducibility. Why does a fictional system known to be fictional exert genuine psychological and cultural force? Several explanations have been proposed, none fully satisfying alone. The mythology structure so precisely mimics real esoteric traditions, hidden texts, hierarchies of initiated knowledge, progressive revelation of dangerous truths, that the brain may process it through the same cognitive pathways activated by genuine religious or occult material. The philosophical content resonates with lived modern experience in ways that comforting mythologies increasingly do not. Cosmic indifference feels accurate in an era of climate crisis, information overload, and institutional failure. The mythology's deliberate incompleteness invites participation. It is an open system, a framework that rewards elaboration, and this participatory quality generates the same community dynamics and the same sense of collective ownership as genuine folk traditions. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is the simplest. The distinction between real and fictional mythologies may be less stable than we assume. All mythologies were, at some point, invented. All invented mythologies, if structurally robust enough and psychologically resonant enough, can become functionally real, not in the sense that their entities physically exist, but in the sense that they organize behavior, generate communities, produce cultural artifacts, and shape the emotional landscape of those who engage with them. Lovecraft may have demonstrated not a special case, but a general principle about the nature of belief itself. And if that is the case, then the mythology's escape from fiction is not an anomaly to be explained, but a property to be studied, evidence of something about how human minds build and inhabit meaning systems that we do not yet fully understand. Lovecraft's mythology presents a fundamental structural problem for visual media. Its horror is perceptual and cognitive, not physical. The most terrifying moments in Lovecraft's fiction occur inside the narrator's mind, the instant of recognition, the collapse of interpretive framework, the realization that reality is structured differently than believed. A Shoggoth can be rendered with special effects. The experience of confronting a Shoggoth while your model of reality disintegrates around you cannot. This tension between the mythology's conceptual power and the demands of visual storytelling which requires showing, externalizing, making visible, has shaped every adaptation attempt for nearly a century. Direct film adaptations have a troubled and largely disappointing history. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, 1985, and From Beyond, 1986, are the most celebrated, and they succeed precisely by abandoning Lovecraft's tone entirely. Gordon replaced cosmic dread with body horror, splatter comedy, and the manic energy of 1980s practical effects filmmaking. Jeffrey Combs's performance as Herbert West in Reanimator is iconic, intense, darkly funny, entirely un-Lovecraftian. The results are entertaining and effective as genre cinema. They are also not remotely Lovecraftian in atmosphere or philosophy. More faithful attempts, the various low-budget adaptations of The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, and the Dunwich Horror, produced between the 1960s and 2000s, have generally struggled with the same irreconcilable problem. Fidelity to Lovecraft's literary method produces films that are atmospheric but narratively static, because his stories are fundamentally about internal states, while fidelity to cinematic storytelling conventions produces films that are watchable but philosophically hollow, because the act of showing the monster necessarily diminishes it. Guillermo del Toro's long-planned adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness, backed at various points by Universal Pictures, attached to Tom Cruise, budgeted at over $150 million, storyboarded in extraordinary detail, has spent over a decade in development limbo, repeatedly approaching production and repeatedly collapsing. Its persistent failure to reach the screen may itself be the most Lovecraftian adaptation ever produced. A project that cannot be completed, a vision that resists materialization, a story that the medium literally cannot contain. The films that have most successfully captured Lovecraftian horror have done so not through direct adaptation, but through indirect absorption of the mythology's principles. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, never references the Cthulhu Mythos, but enacts its deepest premises. An alien organism that absorbs and perfectly imitates other life forms, generating a paranoia rooted not in external threat, but in the impossibility of distinguishing human from inhuman. The horror of The Thing is epistemological. You cannot trust perception. You cannot trust identity. You cannot trust the person next to you. And this is Lovecraft's horror translated into cinematic grammar. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, translates Lovecraftian ideas into biological science fiction, a zone where the fundamental rules of biological identity are rewritten, where DNA refracts and recombines across species boundaries, where the human characters are not attacked, but transformed in ways they cannot comprehend or control. Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, 2019, traps two men in a space where reality gradually becomes unreliable, sanity indistinguishable from madness, and the boundary between human psychology and cosmic mystery dissolves in salt spray and kerosene fumes. Richard Stanley's Color Out of Space, 2019, starring Nicolas Cage, adapts one of Lovecraft's most unfilmable stories, about a color that falls from space and corrupts everything it touches, through saturated cinematography and body horror that conveys the alien intrusion through visual distortion rather than monster design. The pattern these films collectively suggest is clear. Lovecraftian cinema works best when it treats the mythology as a set of principles: epistemological uncertainty, perceptual instability, scalar incompatibility between human cognition and cosmic reality, rather than as a catalog of creatures to be rendered in CGI. Video games may be the medium best suited to the mythology's particular form of horror, for a structural reason that no other medium shares. Interactive media places the audience inside the epistemological trap, rather than outside it observing someone else's experience. From Software's Bloodborne, 2015, is arguably the most fully realized Lovecraftian adaptation in any medium, and its method is instructive. The game begins as Gothic horror: werewolves, plague, Victorian architecture, silver weapons, a city called Yharnam that resembles a diseased London. The player operates within this genre framework for hours. Then, gradually, the framework shifts. The werewolves are not the real threat. The plague is not what it appears. The city's scholarly institution, the Healing Church, sought not to cure disease, but to transcend human limitation through communion with incomprehensible cosmic entities, called Great Ones. And insight, a game mechanic that literally tracks the player's awareness of the cosmic truth, transforms perception. At low insight, the player sees a Gothic horror game. At high insight, previously invisible entities become visible. The moon drips blood, and the true architecture of reality is revealed. The player discovers the Lovecraftian layer through play, and the discovery cannot be reversed. The sanity mechanic pioneered by Chaosium's tabletop RPG finds its richest, most experiential expression here. Knowledge does not empower the player. It reveals how much worse things actually are. Darkest Dungeon, 2016, formalizes psychological degradation. As a game system, characters develop afflictions, phobias, and breakdowns that affect gameplay directly. Sunless Sea, 2015, recreates the mythology's oceanic vastness as a navigable space of isolation and creeping dread. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, strips the player of weapons entirely, making hiding and fleeing the only survival options, a mechanical enactment of the mythos' central proposition that confrontation with the unknown is not a battle to be won, but a damage to be survived. Musical appropriations operate on a register entirely different from narrative media. The mythology's influence on extreme and experimental music is pervasive, but atmospheric rather than storytelling-based. Black metal bands have drawn on Lovecraftian imagery for decades, finding in cosmic horror a vocabulary for the misanthropic and anti-cosmic themes already central to the genre. Dark ambient artists like Lustmord and Atrium Carceri create soundscapes explicitly designed to evoke the mythology's emotional landscape, vast, cold, inhuman spaces in which the listener feels not entertained, but diminished. Metallica's instrumental The Call of Cthulhu, 1984, and the later The Thing That Should Not Be, 1986, brought mythos references into mainstream metal. The psychedelic rock band, literally named H.P. Lovecraft, released 2 albums in the late 1960s that remain cult objects. Music cannot narrate the mythology's stories, but it can reproduce their feeling, the particular mixture of awe, isolation, and existential vertigo that the stories generate. And for many listeners, that atmospheric encounter serves as a gateway to the literary source. The commercial domestication of the mythology warrants acknowledgement, if only because it presents an apparent paradox. Cthulhu plush toys, coffee mugs, bumper stickers reading "Cthulhu for President, Why Choose the Lesser Evil," t-shirts, enamel pins, bobbleheads, greeting cards. The emblem of cosmic terror, an entity whose mere proximity drives humans permanently insane, has become a consumer product, a mascot, a meme. This appears, at first glance, to neutralize the mythology's power entirely. If Cthulhu is cute, how can Cthulhu be terrifying? But the domestication may function differently than it appears. Every plush Cthulhu is a vector. Every ironic bumper sticker introduces the name to someone who may eventually ask what it signifies. Every novelty item creates a point of contact with a mythology whose philosophical depth vastly exceeds its commercial surface. The cute version of Cthulhu functions as a gateway to the terrifying version, a mechanism of propagation disguised as triviality, spreading the mythology through its own apparent defanging, which is, if you pause to consider it, exactly how a Lovecraftian entity would operate, invisibly through channels its hosts do not recognize as channels, embedded in the fabric of ordinary life. For decades following his death, Lovecraft occupied a paradoxical cultural position, enormously influential and critically invisible. His imagery, his vocabulary, his narrative structures, and his philosophical premises permeated horror fiction, cinema, comics, and popular culture at every level. Yet academic literary criticism treated him as a pulp curiosity unworthy of serious scholarly attention. He was read by millions and studied by almost no one. This began to change in the 1970s, accelerated dramatically in the 1990s, and has by now produced a substantial and growing body of scholarly work, though the scholarship has never been free of the controversy that attaches to every aspect of Lovecraft's legacy. S.T. Joshi is the foundational figure in the academic rehabilitation of Lovecraft. His critical biography, originally published as H.P. Lovecraft, A Life in 1996 and substantially revised and expanded as the two-volume I Am Providence in 2010, is the definitive biographical account, exhaustive in its research, rigorously documented in its claims, and unflinching in its engagement with both Lovecraft's literary achievements and his personal failings. Joshi's editorial work has been equally foundational. Corrected texts of the fiction based on Lovecraft's manuscripts rather than on the sometimes significantly altered magazine and derleth-edited versions, annotated editions of the letters, comprehensive bibliographic scholarship. Before Joshi, scholars attempting to work on Lovecraft were working with corrupt texts, Derleth's silent editorial interventions, and fragmentary biographical information. After Joshi, the field had a stable evidentiary base, reliable texts, accurate chronology, documented context, upon which genuine literary criticism could be built. Michel Houellebecq's essay, H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, translated into English in 2005, approached from a completely different direction. Houellebecq, himself a provocative and controversial French novelist, read Lovecraft not as a genre writer to be rehabilitated into the literary canon through careful argument, but as a radical literary figure whose wholesale rejection of modernity, of human warmth, of narrative comfort, and of the conventions of realistic fiction constituted a genuine and important artistic position. The essay is polemical, deliberately provocative, and unapologetically sympathetic to aspects of Lovecraft that more cautious academic critics would hedge or qualify. Its significance lay not in its balance. It is not a balanced assessment, but in its seriousness. Houellebecq treated Lovecraft as a writer whose ideas mattered, whose formal innovations were genuine, and whose deep discomfort with human existence demanded intellectual engagement rather than condescending dismissal. The racism conversation has become central to Lovecraft's studies and cannot be addressed in passing. Lovecraft's racial prejudices were not incidental quirks or products of unthinking convention. They were deeply held, extensively articulated, and extreme even by the standards of his own era. His letters contain passages of racial hatred, directed at African Americans, Jews, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and virtually every non-Anglo-Saxon ethnic group, that are genuinely shocking in their venom and specificity. The poem On the Creation of Enau Shas, circa 1912, is precisely as appalling as its title suggests. The Horror at Red Hook, 1925, is driven by xenophobic revulsion at the immigrant populations of Brooklyn's waterfront. He, 1925, expresses horror at the ethnic transformation of New York City. The Innsmouth look in The Shadow over Innsmouth encodes miscegenation anxiety into its most fundamental narrative mechanism. In 2015, the World Fantasy Award, whose trophy had been a bust of Lovecraft since the award's founding in 1975, was redesigned following a campaign led by writers, including Nnedi Okofor and Daniel Jose Older, who argued persuasively that an award presented to writers of all backgrounds and ethnicities should not bear the likeness of a documented white supremacist. The bust was replaced. The debate about Lovecraft's racism and its relationship to his literary achievement continues and shows no sign of resolution, because it is not, at its core, a resolvable question. The work is inseparable from the pathology that shaped it. The mythology's deepest fears, contamination, transformation, the discovery that one's heritage is not what one believed, are simultaneously its most powerful literary effects and the expression of its creator's most repugnant beliefs. Any engagement that acknowledges only the power or only the pathology is incomplete. The most creatively productive response to this problem has come not from criticism, but from writers who reclaim the mythology, who enter its spaces and inhabit them from perspectives Lovecraft could not have imagined and would not have welcomed. Victor Laval's novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, retells the horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black man navigating 1920s Harlem, transforming Lovecraft's xenophobic nightmare into a story about the monstrousness of racism itself, reframing cosmic horror as a metaphor for the experience of being dehumanized by the society you inhabit. Matt Ruff's Lovecraft Country, 2016, and its 2020 HBO adaptation set black protagonists against both cosmic horror and Jim Crow-era segregation, arguing implicitly that the real Lovecraftian horror for black Americans has never been tentacled gods in sunken cities, but the systemic dehumanization experienced daily under American racial capitalism. Ruthanna Emrys's Winter Tide, 2017, reimagines the deep ones of Innsmouth as an indigenous people subjected to government persecution. The federal raid on Innsmouth, reframed as cultural genocide, the survivors interned in camps in the American desert. These works do not reject the mythology. They inhabit it from positions of power rather than positions of fear. And in doing so, they demonstrate something important about the mythology's structural properties. Its openness to reinterpretation extends even to the inversion of its creator's most deeply held and most destructive beliefs. The framework survives the reversal of its original content. The house can be occupied by people it was not built for. The philosophical appropriation of Lovecraft may ultimately prove the most enduring and consequential of all his afterlives. The speculative realism movement in 21st century continental philosophy, Graham Harman's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, Quentin Melissu's work on contingency and what he calls the great outdoors, beyond human thought, draws explicitly and substantively on Lovecraftian concepts. Thacker's formulation of the world without us, reality as it exists independent of human perception, cognition, or valuation, is a philosophical articulation of what Lovecraft dramatized in fiction decades earlier. Harmon reads Lovecraft's notorious prose style, the adjective stacking, the vocabulary of inadequacy, the repeated confession that the thing described exceeds the capacity of description, not as purple excess, but as a deliberate literary technique for gesturing toward objects that withdraw from direct access. A fictional enactment of what Harmon calls object-oriented ontology. These are not casual borrowings or decorative references. They are sustained philosophical arguments that treat Lovecraft's fiction as a legitimate source of insight about the nature of reality, about the relationship between human cognition and the world it attempts to comprehend, about the limits of phenomenological access. A writer with no formal philosophical training, who published in pulp magazines for fractions of a cent per word and died believing himself a failure, has become a genuine reference point in professional academic metaphysics. The mythology has escaped not only fiction, not only genre, not only literature, but the domain of art entirely, entering the discourse of pure thought. Whether Lovecraft would have been gratified or horrified by this development is genuinely impossible to say. The final question is the one the mythology itself would pose, and it is the one most resistant to definitive answer. Why does it persist? Not commercially. Commercial persistence is explicable through intellectual property management, brand recognition, and market dynamics. Why does it persist psychologically? Why do readers, viewers, players, philosophers, and thinkers across nearly a century and across every cultural boundary continue to find in Lovecraft's invented cosmos something that feels not merely entertaining or aesthetically interesting, but true? One answer, the most immediately relevant, is historical timeliness. Lovecraft's mythology is more resonant in the 2020s than it was in the 1920s, and the reason is that the conditions it describes have migrated from fiction to fact. Climate change is a Lovecraftian narrative enacted at planetary scale. Vast, inhuman forces that human civilization has inadvertently activated through industrial carbon emissions accumulated over 2 centuries are now operating on timescales that dwarf human political and economic planning horizons, producing consequences that feel like divine punishment but are merely atmospheric physics. The ocean is rising. The permafrost across Siberia and northern Canada is thawing, releasing methane, and, in some cases, organisms frozen for tens of thousands of years. Feedback loops have been triggered: ice albedo feedback, permafrost carbon feedback, ocean acidification cascades that cannot be arrested by human intervention within any politically feasible time frame. The language of climate science, tipping points, cascade failures, point of no return thresholds, extinction level events, is the language of the Lovecraft mythos translated into peer-reviewed, IPCC-endorsed data. Lovecraft could not have anticipated this specific crisis. He anticipated its structure, the discovery that forces beyond human control or comprehension were always operating beneath the surface of apparent stability, and that human activity, far from being cosmically insignificant, had been just significant enough to disturb something that should have been left undisturbed. That is not dead which can eternal lie. The carbon in the permafrost was lying very quietly indeed. The digital landscape provides a second axis of resonance. The internet is, in structural terms, a Lovecraftian space. And this is not a metaphor deployed for rhetorical effect. It is a description of formal properties. The internet is incomprehensibly vast. No single human mind can grasp its extent, its content, or its architecture. It contains knowledge that demonstrably harms the knower, radicalization pipelines that transform ordinary individuals into extremists, algorithmically optimized content that induces anxiety and depression at population scale, traumatic imagery available with a few keystrokes. It harbors communities that function in precisely the manner of mythos cults, groups organized around shared contact with ideas that transform identity, separate initiates from the uninitiated, and generate behaviors incomprehensible to outsiders. It generates phenomena, deep-fake videos that fabricate reality with increasing fidelity, AI systems that hallucinate plausible falsehoods, mimetic structures that propagate through minds with virus-like efficiency, that blur the boundary between real and fabricated in ways that make epistemological stability feel not like a permanent condition, but like a historical anomaly, a brief period of relative clarity that is ending. The Necronomicon was Lovecraft's thought experiment about dangerous information. The internet has made the thought experiment infrastructure. We are all, in a sense, reading the book. Artificial intelligence introduces a third layer of resonance that Lovecraft could not have anticipated, but that his mythology describes with eerie precision. The emergence of AI systems that process natural language, generate images, compose music, write code, and produce extended chains of reasoning, all without consciousness, without understanding, without any inner experience whatsoever, is, in a precise structural sense, an Azathoth scenario. These systems are vast, they are powerful, they are increasingly autonomous, and they are absolutely without awareness. They do not know what they are doing. They do not know that they exist. They produce effects on human economies, epistemologies, creative practices, and social structures. Effects that are not intentional, not directed, not the product of any mind's purpose, but are nonetheless transformative. The alignment problem that dominates AI safety discourse is a Lovecraftian question wearing an engineering mask. How do you ensure that something fundamentally unlike a human mind, operating according to optimization principles that are not moral principles, does not, in the course of pursuing its targets, casually render human meaning, human labor, and human cognitive authority irrelevant? Lovecraft did not predict artificial intelligence. He predicted the feeling of encountering a form of intelligence, or quasi-intelligence, or functional equivalent of intelligence, that is real, powerful, and completely indifferent to the categories by which humans organize their existence. The blind idiot God at the center of infinity now has a computational implementation. Yet the mythology's persistence cannot be fully explained by topical resonance, however striking. Topics change, technologies evolve, crises emerge and resolve or fail to resolve. The mythology has persisted through every shift in the cultural landscape since 1926. It endures because it addresses something more permanent than any specific historical condition: the human experience of scale. Every individual consciousness exists within a universe that exceeds its comprehension by orders of magnitude, temporally, spatially, causally, and informationally. Every human life is, from the perspective of geological time, instantaneous. Every human civilization is, from the perspective of cosmic time, a local fluctuation in the energy distribution of an unremarkable planet. Every human certainty is, from the perspective of information theory, a provisional model constructed from radically incomplete data. These are not Lovecraftian propositions. They are scientific facts available in any introductory astronomy, geology, or physics textbook. What Lovecraft did, his singular contribution, was to construct a narrative apparatus for feeling them, for translating the abstract knowledge of human insignificance, which the rational mind can process without difficulty, into an emotional experience that the whole mind must grapple with. The mythology is a machine for generating the sublime, in the Kantian sense, the apprehension of something so vast that the mind's categories of understanding fail before it, producing a mixture of terror and awe that is, paradoxically, enlarging. The mind that encounters the sublime is not diminished by the encounter. It is expanded by the experience of its own limits. This is the mythology's final paradox, and the most appropriate note on which to end. Lovecraft's cosmos strips away every human comfort systematically and without exception. God is absent or idiotic. Meaning is a local illusion maintained by selective ignorance. Knowledge destroys. Identity is unstable, subject to revision by forces beyond individual control. History is a footnote to histories no one recorded. The species is cosmically irrelevant, a brief biological experiment on an ordinary planet in an ordinary galaxy in a universe that contains more galaxies than the planet contains grains of sand. And yet engaging with these ideas does not, for the vast majority of readers, produce despair. It produces something closer to relief. The relief of encountering a narrative tradition that takes the terror of existence seriously, that does not flinch from the implications of what science has revealed about the cosmos, that does not offer false consolation or comfortable lies dressed in the language of profundity, and that treats its audience as intellectually and emotionally capable of confronting the worst and continuing to think. The mythology endures because it respects its audience enough to offer them nothing. And in offering nothing, no salvation, no meaning, no reassurance, no resolution, it provides something that comforting mythologies, for all their warmth, cannot. The austere, vertiginous, strangely liberating experience of looking directly at the void and finding that the void, true to its nature and true to Lovecraft's philosophy of cosmic indifference, does not look back. Lovecraft died in Providence on March 15, 1937, largely unknown, believing his work would disappear within a generation. His mythology, unfinished, unsystematic, contradictory, built from childhood nightmares and astronomical anxiety and an obsessive love of words that resist meaning, did not disappear. It grew. It spread across media, across languages, across disciplines, across decades. It absorbed contributions from hundreds of other minds. It escaped the boundaries of fiction. It entered philosophy. It became, against every reasonable probability, one of the defining narrative frameworks of the modern era. Whether this persistence reflects the quality of the literary craft, the accuracy of its philosophical content, the structural robustness of its design, or something stranger and less explicable about the way mythologies propagate through human culture, is a question the mythology itself characteristically refuses to answer. Some questions are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be carried, held in the mind like a weight whose dimensions you can feel but cannot measure, whose presence you cannot forget and cannot fully account for. That is not dead, which can eternal lie. And we, who have spent these hours in its company, must now decide what to do with what we know.